Hi students, welcome to the BYJU'S Hindu News Analysis for 23rd of October 2018. So let's get started. So let's look into the first article. So the first article says, why are media regulators soft with scribes, asks the Supreme Court. So what is the context? So when we look into the laws, there are certain laws. One is to do with the protection of the children from the Sexual Offences Act, and then we also have the Indian Penal Code, which bars the newspapers as well as the magazines as well as the visual media, which involves all the news channels, to disclose the identity of the victims of sexual abuse, especially if they are children. So it bars all the newspapers, the magazines as well as the news channels to disclose the names of minor victims as well as the victims of sexual assault, or using their names to print in their visual media or in the print media, so that in case they are revealing the identity of this victim who's gone through this sexual assault, it becomes a criminal offense, and this is prohibited under the law. So what is the section of the IPC that it is dealing with? It is nothing but section 228 of the Indian Penal Code. So what does section 228 of the Indian Penal Code says? Whoever prints or publishes the name or any matter which may make known the identity of any person against whom an offense under section 376, that is to do with rape, and then section 376A, rape leading to death or making victim go into permanent vegetative state, or section 376B, which deals with sexual intercourse by husband upon his wife during separation, and then section 376C, which is to do with sexual intercourse by person in authority, or section 376D, gang rape, is alleged or found to have been committed and shall be punished with the imprisonment of either description for a term which may extend to about 2 years, and shall also be liable to the fine. So what does this section basically say? In case any of the media outlets go about putting the name of the victims on their newspaper or on the visual media, these people will be prosecuted, and then they'll have an imprisonment of about 2 years, as well as they'll be liable to about a fine, which the Supreme Court or any of the high courts will decide on a case-to-case basis. But what is the current context here? So when we look into the current context, what the Supreme Court says is that all you media regulators that are out there, you are wearing a velvet fist inside a velvet glove. So what do we mean by it? It means that all those people who are currently putting the names of the victims, have you prosecuted any of these people? So there are number of cases in the past. Let's take for example the case of Nirbhaya. So in the case of Nirbhaya, the name was put out, and then in the name of Kathua, the name of the child was put out. So in all these cases, whether in case of Nirbhaya gang rape case or in the rape of Kathua rape case, what you did was you put up the name of the sexual assault person, and in this particular case you are not supposed to put the name, but you did it, and you didn't prosecute those journalists. So what the Supreme Court has done is it has asked all the statutory bodies like the Press Council of India, the Editors Guild of India, the National Broadcasting Standards Authority, as well as the Indian Broadcasting Federation, having no responsibility to inform all these prosecutors. So in case a person has committed a crime, he should have been prosecuted. You, all these statutory bodies, you speak that you have a robust system, you say that you have a system which will make sure that all these people are prosecuted, but instead have you filed a single case where the police is aware of all these things? Not actually. So the Supreme Court in this particular case has given a scathing remark and has criticized all these statutory bodies that they have not done enough to make sure that the privacy of all these sexual victims is actually taken care of. So what the Supreme Court has done is it has given this particular comments, and it is waiting for these people to come back and justify as to why the prosecution is not done in all these cases. What we also need to understand is there are certain exceptions. So what are the exceptions that we are speaking about? Let's say for example there is one of the police officers who is investigating this particular case. Now this particular case will be taken over by another authority. Let's say it is taken by CBI or any other authority. So in this particular case, the police will be able to reveal the identity of the person to investigate who the culprit is. And the next important point that is also into consideration is, let's say for example there is this authorization that is being given by the victim who is a major. In this particular case, in case the victim goes about giving an authorization, so even in that case the police or for example the newspaper channels will be able to telecast the name of the victims. And the third important point is, let's say for example there is a victim who is currently dead, or she is a minor, or the person who's gone through this turmoil is having an unsound mind. In all these cases you can also get an authorization from the next kin of the victim should be giving the permission. In case these are the permissions that have been given by the police in order to help in the investigation or in order to find the culprit, or the victim itself has given the authorization to the newspaper or to the news channels, or the next kin of the victim has given the authorization, then all these newspapers as well as the newspaper and the news media outlets will not be personally culpable. However, what we also need to understand in this particular case is that there are certain gray areas. So what are the gray areas that we are speaking about? Let's take up the first instance. So we did remember during the Nirbhaya case, what was happening was there was floodgates of journalists and all the politicians as well as the media outlets going and bombarding the parents of the Nirbhaya gang rape. So when you have all these people flooding up a particular area, obviously people in and around that area will be knowing about it. So indirectly what is happening in this case is there is disclosure of this particular identity of the sexual victim. So ideally what should have not been disclosed, ideally should have taken into a privacy hold, but now what you see is all the media outlets are venturing into a particular house, and because they are going into that particular house, people in that vicinity, the neighbors as well as the acquaintances who are there in that area will be having a fair bit of an idea who that victim is. So indirectly what is happening? So indirectly the people, the neighbors, the acquaintances in that area are knowing who that particular person is. And also of importance is we did look into certain exceptions. So what does the exception says? So in this exception the permission should be given by the kin, but what has happened in Nirbhaya cases, it is the mother as well as the father who gave the permission. But what does the law say? The law clearly says it is the kin. So even this is a gray area that needs to be taken into picture. While ideally it says it is the kin that was supposed to give the permission, but here the father and the mother is given the permission, but this is not going in letter of the particular law. So this also becomes a gray area. Another important fact that we also fail to understand in this case is you have the number of commissions, right? You have the state commissions, let's say for example the Rajasthan State Commission, Women Commission, and then you have the Delhi Women Commission. These people have lost a sense of sympathy and empathy for the victims. How? They go about to the victim's place and they go on a selfie spree. They have no idea and compassion what this particular person has gone through, but instead they go up there and they reveal the identity, and few people go and further step and they even take selfies with the victims. And the moment this happens, what will happen is all the media houses immediately pounce, and sometimes what this can also lead to is the revealing of the identity of this particular person. So what the government should ideally do is it should restructure this particular law such that there is no identity disclosure in this particular place. And also what the media has to make sure is it takes up all the responsibility that it is given, that is, it is called as the fourth pillar of democracy, and instead what it is doing is it is revealing the details, especially when it came to the Kathua rape. So it has to be more responsible, and what it also has to do is it has to follow the laws that have been constructed, and the government should also look into the gray areas as well as those things which needs to be reworked upon. So apart from this, what we also need to consider in this particular case is what are the examples from the world. So what has India copied from? Where exactly has India copied the laws from? So when you look at the world experience or the world examples, what we have to understand is India is taken the example from the UK. So basically in UK we also have a similar law which is in sync with the Indian law, and this particular law was enacted in the year 1976. Was India also follows a similar law. So what it basically goes on to do is these enactments that UK also came up with basically encourage all the rape victims as well as sexual assault victims to complain against those sexual perpetrators or those people who are assaulters in this particular case. Why did UK come up with this particular law? Basically it makes sure that all those victims come up and say that they have been victims of sexual assault, and also what it says is that the victims will have to move away from all the public gaze as well as those from the humiliation that you would face from the general public. This is in the United Kingdom. However, in US they do not have something like this. US does not, or the laws in the Constitution or the Supreme Court does not bar the media from revealing the names of the people. However, what we also need to consider is media for itself has come up with certain laws where they actually bar themselves from doing it. There are no explicit laws in United States of America, but it is the media which has regulated amongst itself to bring about such actions. So this is what we need to understand with respect to this article, but we will be continuing this after the Supreme Court has heard what are the arguments that have been posted by the Press Council of India as well as the other statutory bodies. But as of now, this is all we have to understand. So moving on, let's look into the next article. So the next article speaks about Nilgiri flowers. So what is important for us is to understand from the biodiversity perspective. So what is this Nilgiri? So it is a shrub that is found in the Shola forest of the Western Ghats. So is it only found in the Western Ghats? Not actually. So this Nilgiri is also seen in the chevrons of the Eastern Ghats, some parts of Idukki in Kerala, and the Sandurbal hills of the Bellary district. So when you consider this Nilgiri Hills, right, the idea of the Nilgiri Hills basically means Giri here basically means the hills and Nili means the purple color. So because of this particular Nilgiri is one of the flowers which actually blossoms and it becomes purple in shade. So the Nilgiri takes its name from the Nilgiri flower, which is one of the shades that it blossoms with. And what this Kurinji grows at is an altitude of about 1200 to 2400 meters. So these plants that bloom at long intervals have a name that is being given, and that is called as the Plantaceales. So what are these? So these are basically nothing but they are those plants which have long vegetative intervals, that is they have long duration of time for them to blossom. It usually takes about 8 to 12 years. In specific, when we are speaking about the Nilgiri flowers, it takes and blossoms once in every 12 years. But when we say Plantaceales, it is those plants or any of those flowers which blossom after a long interval, which is usually in the period of 8 to 16 years. And what we also need to consider is there is one of the tribes that is located in this region, and that is the Palian tribes. So these are the tribes which live in area of Tamil Nadu and Kerala. So kindly remember that the Palian tribes live in the areas of Tamil Nadu and Kerala, and they use it as a reference to calculate their age. And these people have one of the Dravidian languages which goes by the same name, Palian, and this is closely related to Malayalam language. So they have one of the languages, and that is called as the Palian itself, and then it is closely similar to the Malayalam language. And when it comes to their occupation, they are mostly into picking up of the fruits, and they are basically into the manual labor, and they sell all those things that have been collected from the forest area. So this is what we need to understand from this article. So moving on, let's look into the next article. In urban UP, 87% of waste from toilets goes to rivers and farmlands. So what is the context? So when we look into the context, there was one of the news analysis of about 30 cities by the Center for Science and Environment. So it looked into all the major cities in the Uttar Pradesh, and Uttar Pradesh claims that it has coverage of about 80% of the sanitation in the entire Uttar Pradesh. However, what this particular study goes on to say is that there is inefficient sanitation system which ensures that almost 87% of the excreta that is generated because of these toilets are dumped into water bodies as well as the agricultural lands. So let's look at what this particular survey goes about speaking. The first point that it makes is there is no proper sewage system. So ideally, when you see a sewage system, what you should be able to recollect is you need one of the systems which is able to treat all the waste. But in this particular case, because of the sewage system not functioning properly, the effluents from the septic tanks, the water runoff from the waste, which includes the grey water from the kitchen as well as from the bathroom outflows into the open water drains as well as the open drains, and this could lead to a large scale health hazard. And it further goes on to say all the fecal sludge on the other case has to be taken off, and it has to be removed, and it has to be periodically emptied. But we know also from the fact from the laws with respect to the manual scavengers that men are not supposed to be employed. But what is happening in this case? It is the men who are employed in this particular case. On one side you do not have a sewage system, on the other side the men are not supposed to be employed according to the Manual Scavengers Act, but you are still employing the people in this particular case. And the third thing that we also have to understand is there is no designated site for the disposal, which eventually lead to the polluting of river Ganga as well as all those rivers in and around, and this is also polluting the groundwater. So we have three major problems. The three major problem is in the absence of the sewage systems, and then employment of those people who are not supposed to be employed according to the Manual Scavengers Act, and then what you have is there is no designated place where we would be able to clean up the mess that has happened. But instead, because there is no designated place, people are chucking all these sludge which is polluting Ganga and the rivers and also the groundwaters. So these are the number of problems what this particular study goes on to say. So what the report further goes on to speak is, instead of building more toilets to worsen the environment without even providing the sanitation, without even understanding the manual scavenging situation, what we need to make sure is, rather than building more toilets after toilets without addressing all these issues, is leading nothing but to the disaster. So what we need to make sure is address all these key issues that are currently put up, and then we need to make sure that there is sewage connections which increase from the current household of about 28%. So this is what this article goes about speaking. So rest of the factual data is not important from the analysis. This is all we have to know with respect to this article. So moving on, let's look into the next article. So the next article says Supreme Court dismisses plea to lower marriageable age. What is the context? So there was one of the petitions that was filed in the Supreme Court where it seek for a judicial order to lower the legal marriageable age of men from 21 to about 18 currently. So what this petition basically goes on to say is that there are certain laws in the system, for example the Child Marriage Restraint Act, the Special Marriage Act. All these laws currently mention that men can marry only after an age of 21 and women would be able to marry after an age of about 18 years. But what this petitioner has currently filed is that even men should be actually reduced to about 18 years so that there is parity between men as well as women, so that they are able to marry at the same age, that is at the age of 18 years. So what this contender has basically said is, in case we are not able to do is, what this will create is a constitutional bias. What is a constitutional bias that he is speaking about? There is violation of Article 14. Why? Because you are seeing men and women as different. Ideally what should have been done is that men and women should have been treated equally, but you are not doing in this case. Also what he further goes on to say is that there is unreasonable, unjust and improper violation of the Constitution with reference to the Article 15, which prohibits discrimination on the grounds of religion, race, caste, sex or place of birth. And what you are doing indirectly is you are discriminating on the basis of sex, that you have a women age which is at 18 and men's age which is at 21. He further goes on to say, well, people, that is men, are able to vote at the age of 18, they are able to join the army at the age of 18. Why is that? We have this particular restriction when it comes to the marriage age. However, what the Supreme Court has said in this particular case is this is nowhere linked to the public interest. So what this particular Supreme Court judgment has done is this will not be considered as a public interest, but instead if a particular person on a locus standi basis has gone through this grievance, he would be able to personally come up to the Supreme Court and voice his opinion. Since it is not the public interest litigation, what we are doing is we are imposing a fine of about 25,000. So this is what the Supreme Court has judged in this particular case. So moving on, let's look into the next article. So what is this article all about? So what we will be discussing in detail is about the prison reforms. So the Supreme Court has appointed one of the committees that is headed by Justice Amitha Roy, who will look into the entire gamut of reforms that was supposed to be taken up in order to bring a change and a dimensional analysis with respect to the prison reforms. So what we will understand is, let's go back to the history. So is it the first time that such a committee is appointed? Not actually. So what we will have to group this is into two important paradigms. One, we have it is in the form of pre-independence. So the current administration or the police reforms or all the jail reforms that we currently have is one of the legacies of the British Empire or the British rule. But when we look into all these laws, you also have certain people who wanted to bring a change in the system, and one such person was Lord Macaulay. So he presented one of the papers in where he sensed that there is large scale discrimination that is happening in terms of the jail reforms. So what he goes on to say is that there were large scale overcrowding, there were large scale impact where people are not treated as humans, but they do not have even a dignified life. So this is a shock against the humanity, and what he recommends is certain improvements in this particular process. So as a result, what he wants is certain discipline that needs to be enforced, and these discipline is to be enforced in all the jails in and around the country during the British administration. So as a record of this particular call, there was one of the committees that was appointed in 1836, and that is the Prison Discipline Committee. And another important committee came up in the year 1864, and this committee was based on one of the reports by John Lawrence. So this committee again examined the conditions of the Indian prisons, and all that they said was that there needs to be a proper structure, there needs to be a fundamental framework so that there is proper instructions that is laid in the prison management, as well as certain disciplines that are voiced. So after independence, that is post-independence movement, again we have number of committees, and these are some of the important committees which were also formed to look into the jail reforms. So what are the committees that we are speaking about? One involves the Molalla committee, the other involves the INF committee, about with certain recommendations, and all these 658 recommendations were forwarded to the relevant state government. Why was it forwarded to the state governments? When we look into the division of powers, what we realize is all the prison norms comes under the state list, and it is according to the list 2, that is state list of the 7th schedule. It comes under the Constitution of India under the state list, and that is why it was forwarded to the state list to actually go about with the implementation process. However, what we see in this particular case is number of states did not actually go about implementation, and that is the major problem right now. So in order to address all these issues, and also so that the state government also complies with these recommendations, that is why Justice Amitha Roy Committee is actually appointed. So we have had earlier ones, that is Justice A.N. Molalla Committee as well as the Justice INF Committee. However, this committee will also look into the other reforms so that the state governments also go about implementing this particular program. Next thing that we have to understand in this particular case is certain statistics. So what does the statistics say? So the statistics basically goes on to say that the Prison Statistics India, which is brought out by the National Crime Records Bureau, will provide food for thought for Justice Roy Committee. What does it say? It says in 2015 there were nearly 4.2 lakh inmates in about 1401 facilities with an occupancy rate of 114%. About 67% of the total inmates were under trials, a commentary on the speed and efficiency of the Indian criminal justice system. So what do we mean by it? That there are large number of people in the Indian jails, and there is large scale overcrowding, and what this Amitabh committee will have to look into is all these fundamental aspects. So what we need is certain areas that needs to be introspected. Why is the reason that we will be discussing. So the first point that we have to discuss in this particular case is incarceration. So what do we mean by it? It means that there are large number of people who are confined to the walls of the prison, that is there is large scale imprisonment. We did look into the statistics that 67% of the total inmates are about under trials who are there in the jail system. But what is one of the important important paradigms that we need to follow is, as a civilized society, the objective of the criminal punishment is to reform the people, make changes, bring about a metamorphosis in their thought process and leave them into the society. But what is happening in this particular case is majority of them are under trials, and this has to be changed. So the Justice Amitha Roy Committee has to look into this incarceration, that is the under trials, and all those people who are put behind bars for no reason. Even if they have reasons, they should be let go after a few years. Why? Because we believe in the reformative system. And the second important point that we have to understand is in reference to the Hammurabi Code. So what do we mean by it? Even now till date there are number of cases where the people are going through death sentence. So what do we mean by Hammurabi Code? So basically when we say it is Hammurabi Code, what this basically means is a law of retribution, or it is a form of retaliatory justice, which basically means it is an eye for an eye. If I go on to slap another person, he will slap me. If I go on to kill another person, what the law does is it will go about with the capital punishment. So the code basically looks into an eye for an eye, where if you break a bone of a person, then there is equals that is taken into picture, and even that particular person's bones will be broken. So these are set of bizarre laws and gruesome forms of punishment which needs to be changed. So what Amitha Roy Committee will also have to look into is the death sentence that is still there with reference to India, and this also had to be looked into by the Amitha Roy Committee. And the third important point we also need to consider is with reference to the budget. So what do we mean by it? Let's take for example what the government basically goes on to consider in this particular case is that there are number of social schemes, and all these social schemes require a lot of money. In case the government goes about pushing in a lot of money to this particular area of jail reforms, what could be the problem? That there will be a fiscal stress and they'll not be able to give money to the social sector schemes. So what this particular argument goes on to say is that we need to bring about certain changes. We need to bring about more finances to the budget allocation in the jail reforms. So as a reformative society, as a society which is wanting to bring about a metamorphosis in the thought process, what we need is basically more budget allocation to the general jail reforms. And also important point that we have to consider in this particular case is the brutality. So when we consider a number of cases, there are brutal officers as well as insensitive officers who take pride in actually penetrating deeper hatred as well as animosity. So what we also basically need to do is we need to find answers to all these tumultuous questions, bring about reforms, bring about a structure so that the police brutality as well as insensitivity is also addressed. So all these areas, whether in terms of the incarceration or the Hammurabi Code, that is the radical form of death penalty, or more increase in the budget allocation as well as the brutality, have to be looked into in this particular case. As an overall complexion, the overcrowding that is there, the prolonged detention of the under trials, the unsatisfactory living conditions, the inadequate social integration, the corruption that is there in the jail reforms, and lack of legal aid to all these people in the form of under trials will have to be changed, and there needs to be a new approach for the prison staff. So what are the solutions? How is that we will be bringing about a change in this is what this article all about. So when we look into the solutions bit, what we have to basically understand is that there are certain crimes which are basically done in the view form of white collar crimes. So what are these white collar crimes? So these are basically involving not any murder or dacoity or thievery or robbery, but instead they refer to the financial motivation. They are nothing but the non-violent crimes committed by certain business people. So a white collar crime is committed by a business person, perpetuated any crime, but instead he has done it only for the money purposes. So what we can basically do is we can actually disintegrate these people from the system, and what we can also do is deprive these people of all their illegal gains as well as lock them up in different jails rather than in the same jails. So we would be able to confiscate their property, freeze their bank accounts, rather than putting them in jails where all those criminals are there. This could be one of the possible solutions in order to reduce the number of people in the jails. And also what can be also done is we need to make sure that there are certain correctional aspect that needs to be strengthened. That is, there needs to be certain counseling programs, and these counseling programs will have to be in addressing the brutality of the police. So what we need to make sure is all the counseling is given to these people so that they treat the humans as humans and they are giving the dignified life to the prisoners who are actually going there with respect to these places. And there are also certain recommendations that were given in the past by the Molalla committee. So what did the Molalla committee basically goes on to say? So what it says is provide them all the important things like the food, the sanitation, the clothing. So when you're providing them, what will happen is they are going to be a transformative individuals. So the first imperative thing is bring about changes in their mental mindset, and also the prison staff will have to be trained. So when we train these people, all the police insensitivity will be completely gone, and then these people will also transform accordingly. And then what we also have to do is periodically we should also let the media inside so that they would be able to see whether those people who are encountering any problems. So inside the prisons as well as in the correctional institutions, what we need to do is we need to make sure that the general public as well as the media are allowed to go into the jail so that they would be able to get the first hand information and check the conditions of the prisons, and in case there is any rehabilitation work that they feel have to be done, they would be able to propose the same to the government, so that in case they feel that this is supposed to be done, the government needs to take charge of this and they have to make sure that the required amount of changes will also have to be done. And apart from this, we also looked into the Krishna Iyer committee. So one of the important foundations or arguments the Krishna committee brings about is that we need more women police officers. They would be able to understand what a woman goes through, and they'll be able to understand and tackle all the important women as well as the child defenders. So these are some of the recommendations. So on the conclusion bit, what is important here is the political as well as the administrative will has to be taken into picture. All these politicians as well as the bureaucrats to come on a common standpoint, and they should make sure that all these people have a dignified life. So in this article, what we will be speaking is about the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which is also known as the INF. So what is important is this particular treaty was announced in the year 1987, and this was between United States of America as well as the Soviet Union. What is this all about? This is nothing but the Arms Control Treaty. So this was an agreement which was entered in the year 1987 by Ronald Reagan as well as Mikhail Gorbachev. Why? Because there was large scale penetration of the nuclear missiles, and what they entered into was completely withdrawing and using up of these particular ground nuclear ballistic as well as the cruise missiles, and this has a range of about 500 to about 5,500 kilometers. So anything within the range of these particular ground nuclear installations that were there were supposed to be withdrawn. But what we will also have to understand is that this is only for the ground installations, and this is not for the sea launched missiles. So this becomes a very important point, that is all these agreements were only for the ground based nuclear installations of the ballistic as well as the cruise missiles, and this was not there for the sea launched missiles. And what is of importance is, as a result of this particular INF treaty, the United States of America and the Soviet Union destroyed almost about 2,692 short, medium as well as intermediate range ballistic missiles by the treaty's implementation of about the year 1991. So they went about the destruction of all these important nuclear installations. But why are we discussing this? Currently what we see is that US president has actually announced that he was withdrawing the US from this age old treaty. Why? Because he feels that Russia has actually non-complied with this particular treaty. So what he goes on to say is that he complains that Moscow's deployment of one of the missiles, and that is the Novator. So because Russia has actually enforced or deployed this Novator M972 missiles, and it has become non-compliant to this treaty, what President Donald Trump basically goes on to say is that he is not ready to comply by this treaty, and he says that he is withdrawing US from this particular treaty. Why is this important? Because UPSC in the past has always asked questions with respect to START and so on, which we have discussed in the earlier sessions. That is why we are discussing this article as well. So moving on, let's look into the next article. So the next article that we are speaking is one of the important bridges, and that is the Hong Kong Zhuhai Bridge. So what is this Hong Kong Zhuhai Bridge all about? So this is one of the world's longest sea bridge. So what this bridge goes on to do is this will connect Hong Kong to the mainland China, that is the Zhuhai plain. So what is the importance of this bridge? So the importance of this bridge is it will cut the travel time between Hong Kong and Zhuhai from 3 hours that we currently go through to about 30 minutes in this particular case. So what is unique about this bridge is that it is built in such a way that it is able to withstand all the earthquakes as well as the typhoons in this particular case. So it is made use of about 4 lakh tons of steel to make sure that it is able to withstand this particular force of earthquake as well as the typhoon. Can all people travel this particular bridge? Not exactly. Even if they want to travel through this particular bridge, what they have to do is they'll have to get certain special permits from the government. Only after getting certain special permits from the government and allocated by a quota system, and all these vehicles that are traveling will have to pay a toll tax in this particular case. And what is also unique about this particular bridge is after a particular point what you also see is there is construction of the artificial highlands in this particular case. The road stops up till this particular moment and then you have a tunnel which is lengthing about 7 kilometers. Why is this being done? So that all the ships that are traveling in this particular case will be able to move from this area to another area. So this is one of the architectural marvels that China has actually gone about doing this particular process. However, this bridge also has certain criticisms. So what is the criticism that this particular bridge has? There are two important criticisms. One, during the construction there have been large scale deaths, and because of these deaths, that is why there is a major criticism. Another important point is in terms of the environmental hazard. There is one of the important dolphins, and that is called as the Chinese white dolphin. So what is also being predicted is because of the environmental hazard that this particular construction has created, there could be a losses due to this particular construction of dams to the Chinese white dolphin. So this is all we have to understand from this article. So moving on, let's look into the next article. In this article, what we are speaking is about the Mingo Island. So this particular island is in the region of Lake Victoria. So it is along the borders of the Uganda as well as the Kenya region. So there is a dispute that is happening between Kenya as well as Uganda. Both these countries claim that Mingo Island actually belongs to their territory. So this is still in dispute, but what is of importance is we need to know that it is present in the African continent and it is between the Uganda as well as Kenya. So what is of importance is this particular locality is known for its fishing region. So because it has large scale number of fishing zones, this is a possible reason as to why both these countries are claiming this particular region. And one of the most important fishes is the Nile perch, and this Nile perch is one of the cuisines of that is loved by the European people. So because there is large scale export of the Nile perch, that is why both these countries, that is Uganda as well as Kenya, are claiming for this particular spot. This is all we have to know with reference to this article. So moving on. So the next article says panel for adopting UN model on cross-border insolvency. So there was one of the committee, and that is the Insolvency Law Committee. So this was tasked with suggesting amendments to the Insolvency and the Bankruptcy Code of India, and what these people have actually commented is that India should be adopting one of the United Nations model to handle the cross-border insolvency case. So what is the major objective? So when we look into the objective behind it, you have the number of companies. Let's say for example the Indian company Infosys. So you have the Indian company Infosys, which is an Indian company which can also work in the United States of America, and then you also have the other companies, let's say the United States of America companies like the Facebook, the Google, the Microsoft, which also work in India. So there is trans-border and international trade that is happening, but there is also this insolvency that can also result because of these companies which are operating in the multiple boundaries. So in order to address this dilemma, what the Insolvency Law Committee has suggested is that we need to comply or use one of the important United Nations model, and that is to do with United Nations Commission international trade law model of cross-border insolvency 1997. So what this particular law basically goes on to do is, this particular law is currently complied by about 44 countries, that is part of the United Nations. This basically deals with the cross-border insolvency cases. As per this particular model, they have two important picturizations. So what are this? One is to do with the harmonization. So what do we mean by harmonization? So we have the number of domestic laws, right? So what this particular harmonization clause of the unilateral basically goes on to show is that there are these domestic laws. These domestic laws will have to be modified, will have to be changed so that there is predictability. So you have the domestic laws which have to be changed according to the laws that have been set by the United Nations. And the second point that it also speaks about is in terms of the unification. So this unification is all about having a common legal system. So what do we mean by it? On one side, what we are doing is you are making that domestic laws are in sync and resonance with the international laws, and on other side you have all these national companies as well as the international ones coming on a global platform, and they have a common set of objectives. So we are making sure that these common objectives are in line with those particular principles that have been laid also by other countries. So what are the advantages? So when we look into the advantages, what this particularly goes on to say is this unilateral model that has been adopted gives importance to the public interest. Because it gives importance to the public interest and also to the domestic laws, that is why that becomes a very important one. Another important point that we also have to generate is that this provides confidence to all the international foreign companies. So because we are complying with the UN based model, because we are complying by UN set model, what this will also do is it will give confidence to all the foreign companies who are planning to do their business in India. Why? Because there will be certain flexibility, there will be seamless integration, and all these laws, because they are also in tandem and robust with the international culture, that is why it will give the confidence to the foreign companies so that they will be able to come down and also invest in the home country. So this is what we need to understand from this article. So moving on. So let's look into the prelims practice questions. So the first one here says consider the following pairs. So it says the tribe and the state of occurrence. Limbu is in Sikkim, Karbi is in Himachal Pradesh, Dongria Kund in Odisha, and Bonda in Tamil Nadu. So the answer for this is only 1 and 3. That is, Limbu is correctly matched with Sikkim and Dongria Kund is correctly matched with Odisha, and Karbi here belongs to us, and Bonda here belongs also to the Odisha. So the correct answer here is 1 and 3. So the second important question, between India and East Asia, the navigation time and distance can be greatly reduced by which of the following? The answer for this is B only, that is opening a new canal across Kray Isthmus between the Gulf of Siam and the Andaman Sea. So moving on, let's look into the mains practice questions. It is important to ensure the defamation law is no longer used as a tool for harassment. Examine. Political will is crucial to reform India's criminal justice system. Analyze. So kindly write all your answers in the comment section. We can have the peer review, and also we will look into the answers and then give you the relevant feedback for the same. So this is it for today. Thank you so much. All the best.